Well, if you don't consider this one of the better MCU movies, I guess you can say it's not a god tier film. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and a brand new review series. With the upcoming release of Thor, Love and Thunder, I'm going to first discuss all three of the other Thor movies. And once I get to my review of Thor, Love and Thunder, I'm going to rank all four films. So we're kicking things off with the original 2011's Thor. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it. And make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content like Marvel reviews on a near-daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about Thor. This stars Chris Hemsworth as the powerful but arrogant god Thor, who's cast out of Asgard to live amongst humans in Midgard, aka Earth, where he soon becomes one of their finest defenders. So as I've done previously with my reviews of other older films, this will get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen Thor by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But now that you've been warned, here we go. This is directed by Kenneth Branagh, and it's the fourth film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as part of the franchise's build-up to the Avengers, with this being the first ever portrayal of this character in live-action form. Though, fun fact, one thing I did learn recently was that we possibly could have gotten a version of him sooner, as Sam Raimi tried pitching an idea for a live-action Thor to 20th Century Fox in the 90s, but they shot him down. Guess who has the last laugh though now, huh? Now, this is an interesting entry in the MCU. It was positively received at the time, but there was still a fair amount of criticism for it then due to its plot and inconsistent tone. And it was viewed as a prime example of the MCU still finding its footing in its early days. So generally, you'd find it somewhere towards the bottom, lower middle of a lot of MCU rankings, at least from the ones I've seen. Though in recent years, with the shift to a more comedic characterization for Thor due to Ragnarok and Infinity War and Endgame, I've seen people who don't really like this new path for the character now go back and praise this movie a little more in retrospect. Like, they'd wish the MCU would go back to this particular characterization, which, while still playing into some comedic elements, is certainly much more dramatic than what we get now. And I found that interesting, how this is now viewed by some as what the MCU should be doing. So, where do I stand on the whole thing? Well, I will say this. I'm glad we went in the direction with Thor we eventually have now, and I prefer it more than how the character's been portrayed in his earlier days. But that being said, I don't think this movie's all that bad. Now, I've always liked it to some degree, but while I personally still wouldn't call it one of the best MCU movies out there or anything by a long shot, I actually have come to appreciate this a little more for what it is with each successive viewing. It's not perfect, and its problems are pretty noticeable, but the somewhat bad rap it got in its early days I don't think was completely warranted. So, one, or should I say two, of the big reasons this is as enjoyable as it is are Chris Hemsworth as Thor and Tom Hiddleston as his brother Loki. It's actually interesting how casting both of them was viewed as a bit of a risk at the time, as prior to this, both of them were unknowns. They've only been in a couple of movies each before this, with Hemsworth being slightly more recognizable as he had a small part as Kirk's father in the Star Trek reboot, but these weren't big movie stars, as opposed to Iron Man having Robert Downey Jr. and the Incredible Hulk having Edward Norton. So, you had two unknown actors leading a movie about a character who's never been portrayed in live action before in the lead up to a big team-up crossover movie which, at the time, was virtually unheard of, as wild as that is to say, only being 10 years ago. But they pulled it off, and these two wind up being some of the most endearing parts, not just of this movie, but of the MCU as a whole. Hemsworth brings a lot of passionate energy to him as the titular character, and finds a nice balance between being an endearing, tragic figure during the sequences in Asgard, while also tapping into his more comedic side during the sequences on Earth. While the MCU's casting decisions have mostly been on point, he's honestly one of my favorite casting choices altogether. He may not have tapped into his true potential with this character until a little later on, but it was clearly noticeable how good he can be right out of the gate. And Hiddleston is also a great villain as Loki. With a title like God of Mischief, This is someone who they could have easily gone down a much goofier route with, like this much more comedic, over-the-top villain, and not that he doesn't get to tap into his comedic side as well at times here, but Hiddleston is another one who manages to find a nice middle ground where he gets to tap into this seething jealousy he has for his brother, and we find out he's been working with these monstrous frost giants, and that's one of his primary motivators, but he does so in a way that feels subtle and nuanced, which made him feel really compelling. And while he shifted to more of an anti-hero these days, he was easily one of the better villains in the MCU's earlier days. And to just stay on that cast for a moment, you had a lot of great names all throughout this. You have Natalie Portman as Thor's love interest Jane, Idris Elba as Heimdall, who oversees the bridge between the realms, Stellan Skarsgård as Professor Selvig, Rene Russo as Thor's mother Frigga, Anthony Hopkins as his father Odin, and many, many others. A lot of big names throughout this cast, and while I wouldn't say everyone was utilized to their maximum potential, especially Russo and Hopkins, they all did well with what they were given, and they at least elevated a lot of the shoddier material. More on that in a moment. Though I especially like the chemistry between Thor and his friends Lady Sif, played by Jamie Alexander, and the Warriors 3, played by Ray Stevenson, Josh Dallas, and Tadanobu Asano. We see them all on a mission together in one of the film's opening scenes, and then there's a subplot, once Thor has been banished to Earth and Loki takes over Asgard, where his friends go out on a search for him as a means to stop Loki. Now, we don't get to explore this relationship as much as I would have liked, but in the brief moments we do get to see them all together, the camaraderie feels so natural. They get in these brief, light moments of fun banter, and the moments in which they all come together feel satisfying for just how endearing they feel when they get to play off one another. I also appreciated the direction by Kenneth Branagh. Now, for those who might not be the most familiar with Branagh's work, he built up his career through film adaptations of Shakespeare, including Henry V, Hamlet, and Much Ado About Nothing. While he has a very eclectic filmography both as a director and as an actor, he's probably most closely associated with his Shakespeare adaptations. And he channels a lot of that Shakespearean influence into his direction of this film, primarily in the Asgard sequences. The way that many of the Asgardians interact with one another, it feels very grandiose, bombastic, and larger than life. It tries to lean into the fact that they're all these godly beings, which is why the delivery will feel reminiscent of watching a Shakespearean play, which is for better or worse, depending on how much you actually like Shakespeare. And all the action staged well for what it was, with some solid visual effects. It's nothing particularly groundbreaking, don't get me wrong there. This is by no means the MCU at its finest when it comes to its fight scenes, choreography, or anything of that nature, not by a long shot, but the costume designs for everyone look solid, and the action scenes were fun for what they were. I thought especially the sequence in which we get a cameo from Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye was particularly well done, with the frequent cutting back and forth between him ready to take this shot at Thor, while Thor himself is fighting a bunch of agents to get his hammer back, being a nice touch at building tension. And I also appreciated the pacing for all this. At this point, we're so used to the MCU movies being well over 2 hours long, and that seems to be the standard that most people want to set, but this is just under 2 hours, and it's paced just fine. Rarely did I ever feel bored with this, even during moments where I don't think it worked. I think what especially helps too is the fact that this actually really doesn't follow your typical MCU origin story, given the fact that Thor is a godly being who's obviously been around for thousands of years prior to the start of this movie. Sure, he has to go through some variation of the hero's journey where he learns to let up on his arrogance and pride, as we see during his time on Earth, but with him already being this established hero otherwise, we don't have to necessarily go through all the usual beats we have to go through with other heroes in this universe where they have to get this whole background on their life prior to becoming a hero, then we see them get their powers, get used to their powers, and so on. We just get thrown right into things with Thor and his friends on this mission, and it's there that we pick up on a lot of the characterizations and relationships. It might not be executed the smoothest, which we'll get into in a second, but it at least gets things going a little quicker than normal, and it doesn't feel so by the numbers necessarily. Now, all that being said, while I do think this movie's a good bit of fun, it's still not one without its issues, and I think the main things for me are the tone and the screenplay. And I actually think that the tonal issues would have been fixed for the most part had elements of the screenplay been better. One of the main criticisms I think I've seen regarding this movie is that its tone will drastically shift. During the Asgard sequences, it wants to be this grand Shakespearean epic that is incredibly self-serious, but then we get to the sequences on Earth and we get a lot of this fish out of water comedy. And when we go back from one to the other, it can feel jarring. We'll have these somber, self-serious moments discussing how Thor lost it all, or how Loki's taking over Asgard because of all this pent-up rage he has, and then that'll be followed by these goofier moments of, say, Thor being hit by a car or him smashing a glass wanting a drink. Now, I generally don't have a problem with a film trying to get us to express a wide range of emotions. That's actually something that I think is needed in most films, especially blockbusters, as you want that balance. But the way this shifts can be a little off-putting. And it's not even that I have a problem with the comedic aspect specifically, because, quite frankly, I think all the Earth sequences are the better parts of this movie. As I've said, Chris Hemsworth probably works at his best as a comedic actor, and while this doesn't fully tap into that, the moment where he is allowed to lean into those elements more is where the film's at its strongest. And I got what the film was going for by making these sequences as goofy as they were. You have this strong, powerful being who thinks he's superior to everyone, and by stripping him of his power and being on the receiving end of some of these jokes, it knocks him down a peg. So I get that, and I like that. Still, because of how self-serious the film's tone is during these sequences in Asgard, it just feels like we're watching two completely different characters working here. And that actually feels the same way for just about any of the Asgardian characters who appear on Earth, like Sif in The Warriors 3 later on. There just didn't feel like there was a consistency between the way they act when they were in their element and them on Earth. And it goes beyond them just being in an unfamiliar setting. It's like any sense of that goofiness that you see on Earth, you don't even see a hint of that during the Asgardian sequences. I think what would have also helped is that those Asgard scenes are also not exactly all that well written from a dialogue standpoint. I get that it was taking a page out of Shakespeare, and in Shakespeare, characters might make these grand proclamations or big speeches, but a lot of the dialogue during these sequences felt a little too corny, and it came off as a little unintentionally funny to me in a few lines here and there, rather than anything emotionally compelling. Like, despite some great actors saying all this, it just didn't feel completely believable, or it just felt too over the top. So I think had there been better written dialogue so that it made these moments truly emotionally compelling, and that the characterization felt a little more consistent with what we got on Earth, then it would have flowed so much smoother. And I also think that both Hopkins and Russo could have been utilized so much more, as I mentioned earlier. Like I said, I thought both did well with what they had to work with, but they were sidelined for like much of the movie, and because of that, whenever we did have moments that leaned into their relationship with either of their sons, it just didn't have the most emotional impact. And regarding the Earth scenes, only thing I'll say is, I do think Natalie Portman also wasn't utilized the best here. Now, she does fine with the material, and she does have some nice chemistry with Chris Hemsworth. There were moments between them that felt sweet, but Jane's characterization in general was pretty weak. She doesn't really get this emotionally compelling arc outside of doing this research that gets stolen from her, and she eventually falls for Thor. But it felt like a mostly thankless role that was only elevated by Portman's performance, if I had to be quite honest. Same goes for Stellan Skarsgård as Selvig. Say that 3 times fast. That's another role that I found to be a little thankless, outside of just telling Jane not to get involved any further with Thor. It's a role that's not meant to be as compelling as Jane, obviously, but again, it still felt a little thankless. Sometimes it felt like he was just there. The only one who I felt was the most entertaining of the main 3 Earth characters, to be quite honest, was Kat Dennings as Darcy. Again, not the deepest role, but at least here she gets in some nice moments of comedic relief with some solid one-liners, so I thought those were at least enjoyable. And honestly, this might not be the most popular opinion, but with these early Thor movies, I actually thought she was one of the brighter spots of these films, so there's that. And one last thing, while Loki himself is a good primary villain for this movie, the secondary villains I found to be pretty underwhelming, which goes back to this general problem the MCU seems to have with most of its villains not being all that well written. Here, we get the Frost Giants, led by Colm Feore as Laufey. Honestly, these are characters that I almost completely forget about every time I've seen this movie. I won't remember that they're there till I'm actually watching the movie again, and then I immediately forget about them when the movie's over. I always misremember this film as Loki just unleashing this army of unnamed beings on Earth, but honestly, that might as well have actually been the case. Fiore's Laufey is the most prominent of the Frost Giants, but honestly, I couldn't name a single line of dialogue from the character or name a single action taken by him that I found to be memorable. He's just a bland, poorly written villain, and we don't really feel the weight of his threat when he arrives on Earth. Like, the fight of Thor versus any villain besides Loki himself feels more like an afterthought here. And in some ways, as weird as this is to say, I didn't mind so much, as this was ultimately more about Thor's actual character arc more than anything. But on the other hand, it just made this feel a little smaller than scale than it should have been. Like, it didn't need to be on something as grand of a scale as some of the bigger superhero movies of all time, but for a movie that's focused on these godly beings and mythical creatures, it should have felt maybe just a bit more epic at times. And that includes making its secondary villains feel a little more memorable. It's still an entertaining movie overall, but there could have just been a little more. Thor isn't exactly the most ideal first outing for the titular hero, but honestly, despite my preference of where they later took this character, this movie's not really all that bad. Now, it might get undermined by some tonal inconsistencies, forgettable secondary villains, underutilized supporting characters, and some clunky dialogue. But Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston are both great here, and the rest of the cast were all very charismatic when working with what they were given. Plus, the fish out of water comedy that takes up most of the film is very entertaining, as are some of the action scenes. It's really not the smoothest ride out there, and I get that, but it's still a breezily paced, enjoyable blockbuster that I still quite enjoy. Thor gets a 7.5 out of 10. So stay tuned, as up next will be my review of Thor: The Dark World. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Thor, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you like how Thor was portrayed here? Is this actually one of your favorite MCU movies? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.